Good evening and welcome to VGO Creative Minds at Massey Hall, presented in partnership with CBC Arts and BAMP Center for the Arts and Creativity. Please join us in welcoming the host of The Current on CBC Radio 1, Anna Maria Tremonti.
Good evening. Welcome to the third edition of Creative Minds. We welcome you here acknowledging that this land is the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation and was also the territory of the Huron-Wendat, Neutral, and Seneca Nations. To get things started, please welcome Juno-nominated musician Iskwé.
This one is written for my people, they're still hurting, divided by the many lines of faith, broken down and scattered round this nation. Want us to blend into one face, still trying to recruit the dominant race. But we're not backing down. We stand strong in our homeland. We be fighting for our freedom, for the language of our children, so they walk with their heads high today. Can't keep a red man down from helping his next man. We stand, defend our hearts and children. This one is written for my people to remind us the hand can never hold us down as one. Growing strong, we look beyond this nation to place ourselves among the rest. The world is ours to do our best. 'Cause we're not backing down. We stand strong in our homeland. We be fighting for our freedom, for the language of our children, so they walk with their heads high today. Can't keep a red man down from helping his next man. We stand, defend our hearts and children. This one is written for my people, they're still hurting. Thank you. Tanse, was es guanesconis nigason, kamamagnets nidodem. Thanks for having me, everybody. My name is Iskwé. This next song goes out to all of our sisters and our aunties and our daughters and our mothers who've left us too soon. It's called Nobody Knows. Lay me down now, lay me to the ground. Lay me down in the shade. I won't be afraid. No, I won't. I won't be afraid. No, I won't. I won't be afraid. where we've been or where we go. Nobody knows, nobody knows where we've been or where we go. Nobody knows, nobody knows. Lay me down now, lay me to the ground, lay me down now, lay me down in the shade. I won't be afraid, no I won't be afraid, no I won't be afraid. Lay me down in the shade. And nobody knows where we've been or where we go. Nobody knows where we've been or where we go. Nobody knows, nobody knows, nobody knows. And I won't let you, I won't let you, I won't let you look away. I won't let you look away anymore. And lay me down now, lay me to the ground, lay me down now, lay me down in the shade.
Alex McAvoy.
It's the basic irony of the information age.
I think that the public is owed an explanation.
The more technology connects us, the more polarized we become.
Now is the time to get on the right side of this.
Crying white mothers are ratings gold.
From fake news to filter bubbles.
Hillary Clinton has personally murdered children.
We struggle every day
This was a major breach of trust.
to distinguish what's real from all the noise.
You want to win a war, you need weapons for that, and we could build them for him.
It's fake, phony, fake.
Can art lead us out of this mess? We've always looked to books, painting, theater, and film
They know I'm black.
to speak inconvenient truths to power.
Get out! Yo!
But when power wants to control those truths, it usually ends up knocking on the artist's door. Tonight, 4 of Canada's foremost cultural institutions present a conversation about the meaning of truth in the age of alternative facts. Can artists help us distinguish fact from fiction? And is that even their job? Salman Rushdie is one of the world's most influential writers. He was catapulted to literary fame with his 1981 Booker Prize-winning novel, Midnight's Children, later adapted for the big screen.
On the stroke of midnight, I tumbled forth into the world.
Often under fire for his writings, Rushdie has rarely shied away from controversy. From 2004 to 2006, he defended free expression as president of PEN America. In his latest novel, The Golden House, Rushdie continues to challenge with an urgent parable about gangsters, immigrants, and a cartoonish American president with a questionable relationship to truth. Andrea Fraser is one of the most provocative artists of her generation. Working in video and performance, she has spent the last 3 decades questioning the very foundations of the art world. For 1989's Museum Highlights, she took on the role of an upper-class guide.
If I had 750,000...
Waxing lyrical about the mundane features of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And in 2003's Untitled, she famously compared art to prostitution by having sex with an art collector on camera. With her latest book, Fraser once again pushes boundaries, exposing the political contributions of museum trustees during the 2016 U.S. election cycle. Charles Officer is an award-winning Canadian filmmaker who's given voice to the marginalized with every film he makes, beginning with his debut feature, 2008's Nurse Fighter Boy.
Everybody has got to fight for something. The trick is find out what's worth fighting for.
Officer's 2017 documentary, The Skin We're In, raises uncomfortable questions about racism in Canada. And his latest film, the award-winning Unarmed Verses, presents a vivid portrait of a Toronto community in crisis through the eyes of an unforgettable 12-year-old girl. Iskwé is a Juno-nominated musician of mixed Cree, Dene, and Irish descent. She's crafted a distinct sound that blends her indigenous roots with trip-hop, jazz, and R&B. And she's becoming known for fearlessly voicing her political beliefs in song. 2015's Nobody Knows turned a critical spotlight on the more than 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. With her latest album, Iskwé challenges conventional narratives about Canada's Indigenous people while celebrating the strength and resilience of her community. The Art Gallery of Ontario, Massey Hall, CBC Arts, and Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, with the support of Jonas and Linda Prince, present Creative Minds.
Now, before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of the series, Jonas and Linda Prince, who came up with the vision for this series and gave the support to make it happen. Thank you so much. And now, please join me in welcoming our extraordinary panel, Charles Officer, Salman Rushdie, Andrea Fraser, and once again, Iskwé.
All right.
Wow. Okay, before we get to the tough questions, I want to go around and get a sense of your recent work, everyone, and your approach to getting at the truth. That is, if you believe getting at the truth, some truth is your job. So Salman Rushdie, I'm going to start with you. Your latest novel, The Golden House, is grounded in American politics. Why did you decide to write a realistic novel about the present-day world around you?
I mean, I suppose the simple answer is because we live in an age of lies. And lies and fiction are not the same thing. And it may be that in a time like this, that fiction is a way of reconstructing our idea of truth.
And how do you approach the notion of truth as a novelist?
I don't have a theory of it. I just have an instinct. It seems to me if a human being comes alive on the page, then the reader experiences that person as true. You think, yes, people are like this, you know, and I think that's what you want from a book as a reader. You want to think, yeah, this is how we are. This is what we do to each other. And this is what the world is like, you know, and I think that's one of the pleasures of reading. And so, you know, you try and offer that.
You have a lot of fodder right now. You've got lots to pull from.
Yeah.
That's an understatement there, yeah. Charles, your latest film, Unarmed Verses, is very timely. What did you specifically want to explore with that documentary?
Right. First, I just want to say that the verses in Unarmed was inspired by satanic verses. So it's kind of Really awesome to be here for this reason. Yeah, it was like around 21 at OCAD, and this book, the idea of what actually words and expression through art and the reaction, the violent reaction, it terrified me, but it also gave me a lot of courage very early. So I thank you for the inspiration.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's the producer and I, Leah Marin, we were working together, and in 2013 there was a acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin shooting, murder. And I specifically wanted to find out what was breaking the hearts of Black youth in Toronto. You know, when these images in the media convey these lives and the lack of value, I really wanted to explore what they thought and how they felt about it. You know, they could have easily been Trayvon Martin themselves. They could easily be a DeFonte Miller, if anyone's ever heard of this young man, who now has to live the rest of his life with one eye because an off-duty police officer beat him with a pipe. And you know, so the idea was to provide agency and space for these youth to speak honestly and to unarm themselves with their own verses.
And as somebody who moves from fiction to nonfiction in the work that you do, what is your relationship with the truth? How do you see it?
I mean, truth is very personal, I believe, and it's for myself. It is you know, documentary and fiction. For me, they're mediums, they're forms. For me, so it's kind of inconsequential to the way I approach the material. I try to connect with it, and also I know that for myself, there are untruths and lies within myself. So I am actually trying to analyze those untruths within myself so I can find truth. Regardless of the form, regardless of whether it's scripted or documentary. The one thing that I can say about the two of them with the truth is, you know, at the end of the day, working in fiction, the actors go home. And in documentary filmmaking, you build these real connections, and that excites me, but it is also very, very challenging at the end of a production to disconnect. So the truth is constantly running through, and I'm trying to interpret it for myself, but it's all about the material and how I'm approaching it.
Andrea, I want to ask about your work. So much of your work examines the political and economic structures of the art world. Your brand new book, 2016 in Museums, Money and Politics, is no exception. What was your intention with that project? What were you trying to reveal?
Well, 2016 in Museums, Money and Politics, it's a 950-page book. It's a telephone book. It includes records of the political contributions of the trustees of about 125 U.S. art institutions in 2015, 2016, and 2017. So in the 2016 election cycle in the United States and its aftermath. And I wanted to get at the truth of how Donald Trump was elected in the United States, of who supported him. When the 2016 election happened, I was devastated. I felt like my reality collapsed. My sense of reality collapsed. Who would elect this man? Who would support a Republican Party that was strategically and systematically attacking democracy and democratic institutions and access to the polls and civil rights and civil liberties? So I wanted to start with my own institutions, the institutions that I work with, and find out who on the governing boards of these institutions were supporting these politicians. But as the project developed, I realized that the problem isn't just supporting radical right-wing politicians. The problem is the influence of money and the influence of extraordinarily concentrated wealth in politics in the United States and also in cultural institutions. So the book poses the question of whether, you know, our U.S. system of privately funded and privately governed cultural institutions, where many trustees sort of buy their way onto boards, serves to legitimize a system of government that's increasingly, in the United States, government by and for the wealthy.
So were you surprised or frightened by what you discovered as you went through those names and chronicled all of this?
Well, I mean, really, it's the sort of scale of it. So we found results for 44% of the people we searched, and that's compared to less than 1% of the adult population that makes contributions at that level. And we found almost $250 million in contributions from people who are on the boards of institutions. So it's the scale of it, really, that astounded me.
You once posed a question, what do I as an artist provide? What do I satisfy? How do you answer those questions for yourself?
Well, I know what I want to do. And what I want to do is sort of catch people to create a kind of aha moment, to create a kind of light bulb moment for people where they can sort of connect in some new way with an aspect of their lives, of their environments, of the institutions they work in, and not only, of other people or institutions, but also of, what are our own motivations, what are our own investments for participating in the kinds of institutions and the kind of social and political structures that we participate in. So for me, that's about kind of trying to provide opportunities for critical reflection on the world that we're in the moment, when we're in it, and when we're sort of doing what we do.
Iskwé, I want to ask you, your new album, The Fight Within, is politically charged. You sing about murdered and missing Indigenous women on tracks like Nobody Knows, which we heard tonight. What kind of impact are you hoping to make with this album?
My main goal is to strike conversation. I think that when I'm writing songs and when I'm deciding what is going to make it onto the record versus what's not, and those sorts of things, I really strive to write from a perspective where I feel like once people hear what I have to say about the song, they get a sense of what I'm talking about, or they know the conversation that I'm trying to strike. But at the same time, it gives them enough room to have their own chats and have their own interpretation. Because I think with art, it's important for people to be able to have sort of that duality in terms of how they interpret what it is that they're receiving. So when we start by listening or watching or hearing, and we have that room to interpret it based on our own needs in that moment, and then from there be able to build on that by understanding what the artist's vision was. I think that's the space that I'm interested in creating, because I feel like that's a place where conversation develops in a safe way and in a constructive way, where people can actually hear each other and participate together.
You've said that the whole issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women is not an Indigenous problem, right. It's a human problem.
Absolutely. I don't think that any population of people deserves to be viewed as disposable, and that's kind of the space that I feel that we feel we're at right now. And to me, that's not anything that's not our problem. Like if somebody were to come to me and say, my family member has been killed, I'm going to care. I'm going to be concerned about you and your family member. And that's something that I hope would be a human reaction, is when we're saying, like, our family members are dying, my hope is that people feel like that's a human thing. It's not an ethnicity, like it's not an ethnicity that's dying. It's not just a culture, it's a person. It's a person that has parents and potentially children or siblings or grandparents. Like there's a web that spans off of this one individual, just like any other family.
So how do you approach truth in your songwriting?
I tell stories based on things that I'm observing either within my own immediate sphere, within my community, within society, and what's happening in Canada. And I tell a side of the story that I think needs additional words, additional mouths, additional hearts behind it. So it's not that I'm telling new stories. I don't feel like I'm telling unique stories. I think that I'm participating in sharing stories that are our experiences in this country. Where, for instance, I feel that Canada has failed us as Canadians in a lot of ways. So with regards to where these stories begin and how this relationship, where it began and how it moved through history and time and brought us to this place that we're at right now.
Okay, I want to talk about fake news, alternative facts, post-truths. Let's set this scene. Salman, you have said the Golden House is about human beings in a time of insanity. Tell us more. How would you characterize this time of insanity?
Well, it's kind of like what Andrea said. I think it's very hard still to believe that this thing happened in the United States. Jimmy Carter was on television the other day and he said, "Looks like America wants a jerk for president." And horrifying that it's true. It's one of those things that impossible to believe would happen, and then it happened. So we live in the age of impossible things happening, things which are beyond belief. A person of this degree of amorality, venality, stupidity, ignorance. As somebody said, it's not just that he doesn't know things, it's that he doesn't know what knowing things is. And this is now the most powerful man in the world. And I mean, I, like everyone else, have been trying to think about how this happened and how it can be reversed, and so on. And the figure that keeps sticking in my mind is that in the last election, 45.6% of registered voters did not vote. Now, when you have that huge a group absenting themselves from the decision, it makes these kind of things happen. And even now, after this wonderful march of young people that took place, there was a piece I read which broke down voting patterns, and in the last election, in the 18 to 25 age group, only 15% voted. In the 25 to 44 age group, only 40% voted. So that young age group, which is the most idealistic, the most progressive, the most anti what's happening in America, they don't show up on election day. And that has to change, or else we're stuck with this.
The narrator in your book says America had left reality behind and entered the comic book universe. Talk to me a little bit more about how you've observed America's relationship with reality changing.
Well, there's somebody in the novel says that it's as if D.C., Washington, has been taken over by D.C. And it feels like that. It feels like we're being run by cartoon figures, As E.M. Forster used to say that characters can be flat or round. They can be two-dimensional or three-dimensional, and it seems as if the power elite in Washington right now is definitely on the flat side.
So what do you do with this? You've also made the point that we've never had so much access to information. We've also never had so much access to disinformation, misinformation.
That's the problem, you see, is that this so-called information age, when you look at the internet, this extraordinary thing, kind of reality and complete garbage exist side by side with the same level of authority. You have completely idiotic, dishonest websites side by side with serious ones, and they both look exactly the same. They have the same degree of authority and credibility, it seems. And so I think, leaving aside Trump and all that, I think people are having trouble sorting it out, sorting out what is true and very valuable on the internet, and what is absolute crap, And so there's a breakdown in our grasp on reality, And I think when that happens in a culture, it's in great danger. You know, and I think that is the underlying danger of which Trump is like the manifestation. People don't believe in the truth anymore. You know, most people, the most trusted news service in the United States of America is Fox News. I mean, you know, you begin to wonder about the people doing the trusting.
Well, and Andrea, the political landscape, especially in the U.S., has blurred the line between fact and fiction. President Trump has even been called the world's greatest performance artist. You are a performance artist. What do you think?
I think it gives performance art a bad name. Basically, it's an insult to my field. But it's dangerous, I think, because calling Trump a performance artist, you know, often calling people performance artists or calling something art is a way of, it is usually a way of diminishing it, of sort of dismissing its sort of importance or its relationship to reality, its reality. And this is very real. It's very real. And Trump is clearly an extraordinary performer. I think like most demagogues, you know, demagogues work through enthralling citizens and turning them into superfans. And I think a performance art is doing the opposite. Performance art is about trying to break that kind of spell and create a reflection on what that dynamic is, what that kind of fascination is, not to exploit it, which is, I think, what Trump does.
Do you think we have enough reflection right now? Or do you think we're caught up in, it's like such a swirl that we can't figure that out? How do you reflect? How do you find the entry point to sort of make sense of it or critique it?
It's very challenging because I think that part of the, you know, I think we live in a deeply cynical age, and the kind of you know, pattern of non-voting that Salman mentioned has to do with that. It's rooted in that cynicism, and it's cynicism that's also, of course, been stoked by Russian trolls in social media and so on. But it may also be a cynicism that comes from sort of you know, it's been a long time since anyone, I think, has taken news at face value. You know, Walter Cronkite is long gone. The sort of voices of truth and reason in the media are gone. And we've all sort of been trained to look for the underlying motive, to look for the subtext, to look for the spin, and to not sort of take anything at face value, which I don't think we should. But that's the real tricky part. I mean, I think there's truth in lies, there's truth in fantasy, there's truth in fiction, of course. And hopefully art and a kind of critical reflection can help us get to the truth and understand, well, what is the need for those lies, you know? What does that fantasy represent? What are the sort of desires and aspirations or fears that the fantasy represents? But then how do we sort of cut through that sort of trap of being in a hall of mirrors all the time? I don't know. I don't have the answer.
Salman, what do you think?
Well, I think one thing I think is that we're all too fixated on Mr. Trump. You know, you wake up in the morning with Trump, and there he is making a racket all the way through the day. And you go to bed with Mr. Trump. Oh, God forbid.
There are non-disclosures over that.
Well, you know, I'm not good at keeping my mouth shut. But what I think we really need to look at the bigger subject of what is wrong with America, of which he is a manifestation. You know, I think of him as an effect more than a cause. You know, and the question is, what has happened to break the country in half? You know, what has happened to America that half the country believes the exact opposite about what the other half believes? You know, I found myself doing a lecture in, of all places, Florida, and And so it was a very largely Trumpy audience, but it wasn't at all the cliche Republican Trump voter. It was a upper middle class, highly educated, college degreed, reading books, affluent retiree kind of audience, and yet they all believed that climate change was a hoax. You know, the whole range of I mean, they'd all drunk the Kool-Aid, you know. And one of them said to me, "Do you really think the New York Times isn't just lying to us every day? You really think that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do think that, except when they're reviewing my books." But it was, you know, somebody. I mean, they were refusing to believe things which are obviously true. I mean, there are things that are true. You know, I mean, I said to one of these gentlemen who was denying science, I said, you know, the world doesn't. If you say the world is flat, it doesn't make the world flat. You know, the world doesn't need you to believe that it's round in order to be round. You know?
How did he respond?
He walked away from the microphone. I mean, that's, you know, the problem is, but I was actually encouraged by one thing, that this was a civilized exchange. You know, that there were 1,000 of them, and there were probably 950 of them were Republican voters. But it was, you know, they didn't throw things, and they didn't walk out, and they heard me out, and the conversation was civil. You know, and I thought, well, okay, at least that. You know, if we can get back to being able to have a civilized conversation in which we disagree violently with each other, that's good. You know, that's something like democracy.
So can I ask, the people who you were speaking to, were they there because they love your work?
I assume they were there because they wanted to hear me say something, which might be, I mean, I might well have read a book of mine, I don't know. But they were there because they were interested in, I mean, they knew who they were getting, you know, and they, I mean, I don't think my political views are any secret, really. So if they showed up, they knew what they were getting, and they came. You know, and I thought that's interesting. I think.
How do you square that with readers who might love what you're doing, but they don't believe, they don't see the world that you see as obvious?
I don't know. You just got to go on having the argument. You know, I mean, I was very, my old friend Christopher Hitchens, when he wrote his book Against God, because Christopher was a debater, you know, he said to his publishers that he didn't want the ordinary kind of book tour. He wanted to go through the Bible Belt. and everywhere he said he wanted them to produce an adversary for him. So they produced, you know, religious figures all across the Bible Belt, and of course these poor bastards had no idea what they were up against. But Christopher said, you know, he was actually encouraged by the conversations because they were civil and they were quite cultured and etc. And I think, you know, we've got to somehow, one of the things that, you know, writers, intellectuals, artists, we're supposed to do is to start debates. It's like what you were saying, Iskwé, about starting conversations. You know, that you want to be able to be at least a little part of allowing people to start talking to each other, you know, in a way that they're not at the moment.
Well, let me ask Charles about that. We talk about documentary as truth. We talk about fiction and truth. How do you bring forward a truth to an audience in a wider world that maybe has ignored certain truths, has ignored whole areas of the community that you're trying to give a voice to?
I think what I do is I take a deep breath and I go forth, because, you know, some of the truths that we actually, like Salman said, it's like you don't have to be told that the planet is round to believe it's round. There's this sort of space, and you know, like the internet has become this sort of space where it's like this soapbox for everyone to actually mingle and speak uninformed and without sort of context. And so what I'm trying to do is actually provide some context from the experiences that I understand, as I understand them. You know, there are real specific things happening right here in our city. And Canada, again, is this place where we assume that we are this, I don't know, this post-racialized entity, and it's not true. But to say that, and someone say, well, if you don't like it here, then go back to where you came from, but that's not really what I'm trying to say. So with respect to engaging in conversation, it's, I feel fortunate to be in a medium where I can present it visually. Because I believe conversations are critical and important, but where are they going? And sort of the action that comes out of that is a little disappointing to me. Because again, I think that a lot of these things aren't new. You know, the way that young black youth are treated in this city, this idea of that now we're having to create mandates and pledges in institutions to recognize indigenous peoples or for gender parity, it's not in the DNA. And what I'm saying is, and through this work, is that this is a perspective and this is actually happening. So the youth, I believe, speak honestly. I think the children and the youth, we understand this, that, you know, there's this sort of, you know, upbringing that we're told to tell the truth and we're trained to be honest, and from when we're little. And, you know, the adults, the grown-ups, who can be absolutely bizarre, are filling this world with lies. So these children are growing up in this world, and no wonder they're experiencing, you know, this influx of mental health issues and anxiety. We keep talking. I mean, I'm a little older now, so I am looking out for the youth, and I think that if we're listening to them, I think that we can actually decipher the truth. It's beautiful to see this march, that these young kids were mobilized, but then we have an adult, a grown person who's educated, wealthy, is, you know, doing fine, and can actually have the space to articulate that these kids, it's their responsibility when a young child shows up with a weapon to take their lives, that they've got to respond. Rather than looking at like that's just a bold-faced lie. It's not right. And this is an adult who actually perhaps may have children of his own. So what I'm reflecting back is as adults in our responsibility right here in this room is what are we setting up for our youth? We talk about this idea that they're our future and we've got to look after them. And then we fill them with bullshit.
And we ignore them. But that you have a 12-year-old girl.
Absolutely.
They seem to have a very clear sense of what bullshit is.
They do. Yeah. Their bullshit meters are strong. You know?
I can't be the only one who sometimes thinks the emperor's new clothes is something we're living out. In sort of where the child says, wait a minute.
And it's these ones that we take a moment. Francine Valentine, this young girl in this community she's 12 years old, and she is an illuminous young spirit, but easily missed, just like many of the youth of color in this country. And that's what's motivating for me. It's the fact that the opportunities for them to even get to a stage of qualifying is something that is critical to me. When this young woman will speak, she has profound words that adults actually can barely grasp. But is she offered this space? Is she given the opportunity to express herself? So that is essentially what it is. I think in my work, I'm constantly, children pop up all the time. And I really, feel strongly that the truth lies within our inner child. So if we can somehow reconnect with that in our spirits and our hearts, and I know that, this man with orange hair, I don't know, I mean, there's a heart beating in there somewhere.
No, there isn't.
He's an alien. No. Yeah, I question that too, because, and that's a disconnect. The disconnect of soul and spirit, the disconnect of our hearts and what that intention or what the agenda is it seems to overrule the fact that there again, it's humanity. These kids that march again, last thing is people mobilized and they came out. Black Lives Matter shut down Pride for 15 minutes and people got themselves in an uproar. Like, is this the appropriate time? When is it an appropriate time to stand up and say, wait a minute, there are lives being lost here? When is an appropriate time for it to be comfortable and digestible for the masses to understand that this is real and these are human beings? For all you say that and someone says, well, what about black on black crime or well, all lives matters? Well, if you look at the way that the system has, that's just a point of denial, So.
Well, there are hard facts on the statistics that back you up.
Absolutely.
Iskwé, and I want to ask you about this because we are at a moment in time when we are hearing Indigenous voices in a new way. You have said you have a problem with the word responsibility.
Yeah, big time. Before I go into that, I can't remember who I heard say this once, but somebody out there in the world once told me that the problem with the world is that adults are responsible for raising children. Right? And if we let kids be kids and follow their lead a little bit more, we might be in a better position. And I think that if we look at the young ones who are educating us right now in terms of gun control and water protectors, land protectors, they're the ones who are at the forefront. And it's important for us as, the generations above to step back and take our egos and just sort of place it over here on the sideline and really listen to them, because we were young too and we had ideas, and I think it's easier for us to forget that and not give them their voice and their time. But yeah.
Respect.
But yeah, so with regards to the word responsibility, I do feel a funny relationship with that word, because I think that oftentimes in the conversation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationship, there is this essence of responsibility that's placed on our shoulders when it comes to creating healthier relationships or mending the relationship based on what's happened over time. And I think that word, language holds a lot of weight, and that word in particular holds a lot of weight for me because it places an us and them separation, right? So when there's this element of responsibility that comes towards us, and I use the word us because in this with respect to what I'm talking about, there's this further divide, and it decreases the onus on one side and increases it on the other. So when thinking of mending a relationship, if we're going to make it as simple as possible, and we think of any human being that you have a relationship with that has gone sour, and both parties have participated in that relationship, whether it was healthy from both ends or not, doesn't matter. When it comes time to mend that relationship, both people need to come forward and be a part of that resolution, right? If the responsibility is on one person, then it's not actually mending anything, it's just sort of masking and wiping things under the rug. And so that's why, for me, that word is a tricky word. I think that it just creates this further divide that makes me feel like we're not being heard again.
Do you, you've also said you don't have the luxury to only write about relationships. Do you feel as an Indigenous artist that there are things you have to do as an artist right now? Do you have that kind of weight of responsibility? Like in one sense it can be a good thing, and another thing it can be,
of course.
I don't know how you feel about it.
My mom would tell you that there's nothing that I feel I have to do. But I do think that when your eyes open to something, it's impossible to close them again, right? And whether or not you choose to participate in the conversation around what you've observed or witnessed, that's up to the individual. Nina Simone, she's got this beautiful quote that I can't say verbatim because my brain won't hold it in, but it has to do with the artist's duty is to reflect the current times or the society we live in. There it is, that's a little closer. And I think that's quite accurate. So for me, when it comes to writing, I would love to to write a love song. You know, my love songs end up political at the end of the day somehow. I don't really know why, but they tend to go that way regardless. And, you know, I think it's because for me, my immediate sphere is concern for my community and concern for my niece who's growing up brown in Winnipeg, concern for my mom, my aunties, my sisters. Like, the idea that the conversation of missing and murdered women is something that happens over here to other people is not our reality. This is, it is our reality, right? Our family members and friends, they go missing. We have a hashtag that says, "Am I next?" I wish that when my 2-year-old niece grows up and learns what hashtags are, that she thinks of that one as something from the past. I don't want that to be her reality. So for me, I have to be, you know, like I do feel this need to be in that and be a part of that movement and that momentum and that collective group of people who are doing all that we can to raise awareness, to have these conversations, to create healthy relationships, to, you know, to build our value in society's eyes.
Andrea, I want to ask you, because we're talking about the creation of art and then you give it to the audience, and then they do what they want with it. And I want to ask you about your relationship with your audience. You did Untitled in 2003, I think it was, right? And you had sex on screen with an art collector who paid you $20,000.
I heard it was.
And I'm giving the shorthand here. I can see the look on your face already. But how do you go about communicating what you want to communicate, and how did your audience react to that?
Well, not as I expected, but I realized that, you know, there were a range of responses. When it was first shown in the gallery, somebody wrote a note in the guest book complaining that it wasn't sexy. So, I mean, one of the fascinating things about doing that piece, there were many, but one of the fascinating things was being kind of confronted by the fantasies and projections that developed in people's minds, because I recorded the piece, and then people in the art field started to talk about it. Nobody would talk about it with me. But I knew they were talking about it, and it took a while before it was shown. And when it was shown, I realized that people had developed these elaborate sort of fantasies in their minds about what it was and what they would see. And that, to me, became an important part of what the piece was, in my experience, that it was this moment of confrontation with perhaps the reality of something and the fantasy that had developed in people's minds about what it was. And that became really, 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 really interesting. Although many of those fantasies were sort of painful for me personally, or difficult to deal with. But, for a long time, well before I did that piece, I developed a sort of principle for myself, and the way that I think about art is that there are no wrong interpretations. I don't believe there are any wrong interpretations of art. Certainly there are interpretations that differ from what artists might intend, but I believe in the unconscious, and I believe that there's a great deal in all artworks that's unthought or unconscious or unintended. And if there weren't, it wouldn't be worth engaging with. It would be dead. And that it's for artists to discover the truth of their work in the response that they get to it. And it might take quite a bit of also additional interpretation to sort of understand what that response is. But, artists also live in their own worlds, and our work goes out and encounters other worlds and other realities. And to me, the art happens in that encounter. And that's where, that's where something happens, and that's where, that's where the truth is. That's where the knowledge is produced, if you will.
I think it's right. One of the things, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of being too programmatic about this. How should we react to a certain reality that we don't like? Because I think actually art is a journey of discovery. The artist is the person who doesn't know what he's doing. You find out what you're doing by doing it. And so the discovery for the artist is the first place where truth happens. And it's very often a truth that is surprising to the maker, as well. And then you hope that people will share that, But for me, if I'm not finding something out in the act of writing, then it's not good enough, And I slightly envy artists who have audiences in front of them. Because I think that the direct engagement that happens when you sing to an audience, or when there's a drama, or when there's a movie, or when there's a piece of performance art, you have a direct, immediate interaction with the audience, and you can see what's happening between the two of you. And novel is sort of slower and more private than that, and so it doesn't have that direct impact, But what it does, when it does have an impact, is it goes very deep, because the imagination of the writer and the imagination of the reader join inside the reader's head, and that can make some changes. But I also think, talking about ethnic. I mean, I come from an ethnic group which is a minority in the United States, and one of the things I actually really like about what is happening in American literature right now is the arrival of a whole range of new kinds of storytelling by people coming from all over the place. American literature was always inspired by Eastern European Jewish immigration and by Italian immigration. But now there are people from everywhere. Junot Diaz from the Dominican Republic, Jhumpa Lahiri from South Asia, Yi Yun Lee from China, Nam Le from Vietnam, etc. And they're all, Chimamanda Adichie from Nigeria, all living in America and seeing themselves as contributing to American literature, but bringing this enormous amount of information and perspective from different places. And I think that's enriching the experience of American readers. It makes them see the world in a more. So that's one way in which you can broaden the idea of the truth. It doesn't just have to be parochial. It can be from many places.
It brings new voices in.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, actually, it's very interesting because I find all that writing to be quite inspirational. These much younger, writers much younger than me. It's something very cool about being inspired by writers much younger than you, not just by the great dead. And I think, I come from somewhere else too. I've got a suitcase full of stuff from elsewhere. And maybe I unpack that suitcase and, throw it at the Empire State Building and see what happens. So I think that's a way in which writers are, in the United States anyway, are really enriching the culture by making it more diverse, more complex, more many-sided, the stories coming from elsewhere and becoming American stories.
Well, let's talk about doing that and speaking truth to power in the process. We know that essentially the first thing those who take power do is they go after the artists. They jail the playwrights, they burn the books, they outlaw the music, they destroy the films. We've seen this in many places. We saw this even in our contemporary world. We saw this in Afghanistan. We saw film outlawed, music outlawed. When you speak truth to power, there can be consequences. Andrea, you poke fun at the art world. Are you worried that you're biting the hand that feeds?
Well, I hope I'm doing more than poking at it, because that really doesn't sound all that threatening. But art institutions are public institutions. They're supposed to be public institutions. They're supposed to be, I hope, democratic institutions. And I think critically examining, critically interrogating democratic institutions is the condition of democracy. And if we can't do that, and if we're afraid to do it, then we're sort of not worth the walls we take up, the space we take up in those institutions. In a way, in the art field, I think I'm much more often, in the American context, there's a very little direct censorship It's indirect censorship. It's what doesn't get funded. It's what doesn't get shown. There are layers of sort of gatekeepers who let this in but not that in. It rarely sort of comes to a head. But a lot of that, I think, it's more accurately described as self-censorship than censorship. So there's speaking truth to power, but there's also examining the truth of our own power. You know, sometimes it's, I think, a lot easier and convenient to locate power outside of ourselves in others that's being abused and not examine our own power and what we do to keep it by censoring ourselves and by not calling out the forms of corruption that we see and that we benefit from very often. So I think it's absolutely necessary.
Charles, what do you think?
Wow. You know, there's the industry I work in is film, television making. It's a power-based industry. And, you know, what Salman was saying, it's beautiful that you're expressing this diverse, you know, space of writers coming into America and expressing that it adds to a quill, it adds to the richness of a culture. I feel that Canada's got to catch up, specifically in the industry that I work in.
Well, you called out Canadian broadcasters.
Well, I do. I mean, I have, and I've said some things based out of my experience. And you know, there's, again, like right now, I mean, in this city, in Toronto, I mean, we have this motto, diversity is our strength, right? And, you know, there are people that are in power that actually can spew those lines very comfortably. But again, like, you know, in their offices or wherever, whatever the agenda or the intention is, it's disconnected. We don't see, you know, individuals in positions of power that actually greenlight these projects or actually can understand the direction of them. You know, filmmaking, you know, I can mention two films. You know, the first dramatic film, The Birth of a Nation, right? It was, I believe it was made in 1915. And, you know, it had, you know, white people in blackface. It was, you know, pro-Klan. I mean, the original title was The Klansman. And then you have this film, Nanook of the North, around 1922. Again, it's the lens of these forms have been based in colonialist ideas and intentions, and the handing over that lens to actually expand, as this country has, you know, I'm very fortunate to be here, and my parents came here, you know, looking for another dimension and an opportunity. Just because you got let in the door doesn't mean that the actual system is going to allow you to move forward. And that's and that is actually what is reflected, I believe, in industry. And, you know, there, again, it's not in the DNA, and there are young, inspiring voices that, you know, that don't qualify, that are still not approvable.
So how do we do better? We are live streaming on CBC right now.
I know, and so I understand, I'm working with them right now.
No, but that's why I'm saying, so like, how can we do better? Like, let's get it on the record.
Well, let's get on the record. Well, you know, I'm not in the place of hiring and firing folks within these institutions. I'm not there. I'm out here just trying to create stuff.
What do we need to think about? What do those people, including those people who are live streaming, what do we need to think about?
Well, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's stop, you know, having these conversations about, well, I do want to see diverse people, or I do want to see these stories. I can't name in my history of growing up in this country where I can actually name in film, you know, there's these call sheets where they have, you know, the actors listed as 1, 2, 3, 4, right? In my experience, I've never worked on a show where the #1 person on that call sheet was a person of color. Only in my own projects, which happen so few and far in between, right? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of if we're saying it, then let's see some results in action. I'm not saying that someone has to kind of step down and relinquish their position. I'm saying this awareness and this idea that if you are looking for this and you're trying to make change, then you have to participate. It's not enough to actually say it. Not in these times when we have all this incredible talent and voices. And especially in Canada, when our Prime Minister is talking about we are welcoming all these people from all over the world for refuge and safety and to prosper. And, well, then let's recognize it. And I'm asking the broadcasters, the programmers, the executives, it's just that to look at your slate of what you're actually greenlighting. And if you can't actually provide this amount of space and that amount of space for these X amount of stories and experiences, well, that's the problem. You got to allow the space, and you have to allow these stories actually have an opportunity.
Iskwé, you want to speak to that? Anybody else want to speak to that?
Well, I think there are versions of this argument in every artistic field.
Absolutely.
And so, for example, in the United States, fewer than 2% of the books published in a year were written in a language other than English. Fewer than 2% are translations. And that compares very unfavorably with most of the Western democracies, where the percentages are much higher. And what that means is that American readers are not given the opportunity to find out how the world is thinking, how the world is imagining, what stories the world is listening to, what Vietnamese writers, other than one or two that are now living in America, does anybody read? I mean, the Vietnam War people think of as something that happened to America. But actually it happened to the people of Vietnam. And we don't read those stories. And so one simple thing that one could ask, if you were talking about what the CBC should do, one thing that I think that publishing companies should really think about is to give more effort towards translation, so that the writing of the world can be available, and so all that thought and dreaming can be available to readers, and that will complicate and interestingly enrich people's lives, and therefore change them, make them think differently. Every so often a book arrives which does that. I mean, for example, just because it comes to my mind, The Kite Runner, was a book that suddenly people could understand the lived experience of what it was like to be in Afghanistan. You look at the news and you see explosions, but what is it like to live there? And that's what literature can do. It can show us the lived experience of the world, and it can therefore make us much more sophisticated in how we think about the world.
So, in the course of my research, just to talk about the art field, there's a lot of emphasis placed on programs and diversity in programs. In the course of doing the research that I did for this book, I discovered that 90% of all the board members of all the museums in America are white.
Absolutely.
So the diversity has to start at the top. If it's not, if the governing boards of these institutions are so undiverse, how is that going to work its way down into the programs without some serious structural change?
Absolutely. It's from the, I made a list, I made my little cheat notes about these questions, and from publishers, the forms that we work in, the way that, the power structures within them, and the amount of convincing and the amount of sort of, trudging through the mud to present the value of a story. The weight is really unbalanced. And we're extremely fortunate to have a couple of things penetrate and find its way. But from the boards to the heads of publishers, broadcasters, executives, programmers, from film festivals to art festivals. You look at the plethora of that, and there are very few people that come from my diverse background that actually can say, you know what, this is a project that actually speaks to this. And you may be seeing it this way, but this is something that actually deserves this sort of space. And the amount of work actually or space that is demanding some room is still so minimal. It's not like there's a flood of 1,000 films okay, let me get real here. There's not even 3, right?
So we're almost out of time here, and I want to ask you, to what extent then can writers and artists not only challenge power, but ultimately reframe the narrative?
Well, I think that's the gift of having the ability to tell stories. And I think that is why what you mentioned about despots attacking the arts, is because the more tyrannical you are, the greater is your desire to control the narrative. You want to say, this is how we will think, and this is how we will speak, and this is how we will not think and not speak. And if you do that, we're going to come after you. Yeah. That's what power tries to do, and abusive power does that more. So writers and artists are people competing for that territory, because we are also framing the narrative. We're also saying, think about it this way. It could be, have you ever thought what it might be like to look at it from this perspective, which is not yours? Not yours economically, not yours racially, not yours nationally. How about supposing what you think is wrong? How about looking at it like this? And this is what artists do. They challenge what we know. They ask questions that we haven't been asked, and maybe that they don't themselves know the answers to. But questioning, is a part of what it is, and challenging the power of power to write the narrative. And so, we will tell the story. We'll tell our story. Yeah. You don't get to tell the story. And they don't like that. We're scary people.
So given how we began this conversation with the scary realities, I want to ask each of you how optimistic or pessimistic you feel about the future with your art and the ability to frame that narrative. Iskwé, let's start with you.
I think that with regards to the conversations that I have, if we're going to look at things and ideas such as reconciliation, for example, and that was a big word that was floating around last year. And I think that for myself, in terms of whether I'm optimistic or not, I like to look at how long history took place before we got till 2017. Right? Like, how long was Canada a country? How long was the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in place to get us to the state of having the conversation of reconciliation? And then look at all of those hundreds of years and say, I think it's kind of unlikely that everything will be mended by 2018. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that I'm pessimistic that we're not on an upward...
You have a long view.
But I'm in it for the long haul.
Andrea?
Hell in a handbasket. I think I'm a pretty pessimistic person. Although things are starting to look up for the midterms. But who knows what will happen, between now and then. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and anxiety that I feel about the state of the world. And but I'm also aware of the sort of the real danger of nihilism that's so present, and again, that cynicism that it breeds, And we have so many you know, it's so satisfying to see the world be destroyed on the big screen over and over again on so many levels. And
But
well,
it's
what
still
is
there
that?
when you go out of the movie theater.
That's right. That's the important part. That's the important part. So I don't know. I mean, I struggle. I struggle with optimism and with the difficulty of change. And within my field, you know, I tell my students, I say, well, you know, we've had 100 years of the avant-garde, you know, trying to attack the institution of art and critique the institution of art and tear it down and reintegrate art into life. And where have we gotten? We've gotten the biggest global art world ever. A multi-billion-dollar industry. So there's something else that needs to happen, and I'm not sure what it is.
Charles? I'm going to have some in the last round. I'm going to go to you next.
You know, I have to agree with Iskwé. It's in that perspective of the amount of years and seeing the way that the system moves, that I wouldn't say that I'm jumping out of my seat saying, yeah, I'm excited about the way things are going. Perhaps I need to see more shifts, and then I'll be optimistic about the sort of institutionalized way that things are done. What I am optimistic and inspired by, again, I'm bringing it back to the youth. I feel that as long as I can, you know, continue to do something and take a look at the next generation, that is where I'm finding the strength. That is where I'm finding power. And that is where I'm finding the energy to actually get up and go and go through this sort of exercise. The beautiful thing about art, I think, is that it's immortal. It's going to be here long after I transition, after we transition. And these messages, these little sprinkles or these things that we leave behind are there so that I believe that another generation, maybe, you know, or 3 or 4 generations to come, we've kind of sprinkled some things to remind individuals of the time that we're in. We are commentators of our time, and we are seekers, and we are trying to delve at the truth and uncover some things. And I'm optimistic about that journey. I feel like it's sometimes the most safest place to be. And it's when you have to get out of the door and actually, you know, engage on the other levels that is actually a little more disturbing. But I'm very, very optimistic that, you know, these pledges and these mandates that are going out, I'm going to be watching. And other people are too. And if you are having a hard time finding a young Indigenous writer or filmmaker or creator of some kind, and you know, I can give you some lists and some names. And you be careful; they might inspire you too.
Salman?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that it seems unfashionable to quote a Marxist philosopher.
Go for it.
But the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci has this famous line, which I keep clinging on to, where he said, what you should have is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. You know, so yeah, of course, you look at the world and it looks pretty awful, but that's no reason to stop, you know? And that's why, you know, this movement that's coming from below, you know, is where the optimism is, you know. It's not, I mean, yes, young people, but not just young people. There are people beginning to run for office in America now, the kinds of people who've never run for office. Many of them are women, and who come from all walks of life, and that's where the dynamism is, you know. And I really think it's time for my generation to step aside. You know, all these people.
Not you.
Not me personally, of course. No, of course. I accept myself. but you know, what? Trump is 72. Hillary Clinton is same age. Bernie Sanders is 172. And please, could you go home and plant carrots?
We're going to end it right there.
That's awesome.
Charles Officer, Salman Rushdie, Andrea Fraser, Iskwé. Thank you for coming here tonight. Thank you.